After the last debacle when I attempted casting, I needed to give it a second try. I still haven't planned far enough ahead to actually have proper mold making silicone on hand when I'm making these videos. And I'm not sure I want to spend that kind of money on something that I could potentially get for under $10. So we're going back to hardware silicone. I've learned a lot along the way, especially thanks to a helpful comment from Campaign Terrain on last week's video. This tip led to a useful string of Google searches that terminated in an instructable. As its author explains, the biggest struggle with hardware store silicone is getting the inside to cure. Since silicone needs moisture from the air to cure, often the outer layer of the mold will cure and the inside will remain gooey, like we saw last week. To fix this, we can mix in some cornstarch, which holds moisture from the air and then can mix the moisture inside the mold. So that now that we have a plan for a better mold, we need something to make a mold of. For this, I decided to go with a simple door. One of the most memorable exposures I've had to silicone mold making was from Blackmagic Craft, where he molded a handcrafted door, then made resin copies. Doors are a phenomenal thing to have on hand. I've tried to craft a door from foam, and it led to less than stellar results. I'm sure it can be done, though. The alternative would be to sculpt a door, which isn't practical to do every time you need a door. For me, since my default sculpting medium is Sculpty, I would not only need to spend an hour or two sculpting, but also get the oven ready and bake the piece. And while baking the piece does not add a significant amount of time, the trips to the oven can ruin my workflow. So why not save future me the hassle and prepare a whole bunch of doors? I chose to go with a simple square door. To get the Sculpty into an even layer, I raised the rolling pin off the table on 2 even metal spacers. This way the clay will be rolled down to the height of the spacers and no further. I used a straight cutter to chop the door into a 1 inch by 1.5 inch piece, using a ruler to make sure everything stayed even and square-ish. Then I went on to make the door look wooden. First I marked 4 lines using my cutter to space out 4 planks for the door. Then I used the pointy sculpting tool to deepen these lines and add wood grain. I don't have the steadiest hands, so the lines aren't perfectly straight, but that adds realism since neither wood grain nor boards are perfectly straight, especially in a medieval setting. I also added a few knots in the wood grain to give it a little bit more detail. I wrapped the board lines onto the bottom and top of the door and also continued the wood grain on the top, bottom, and sides. Typically these areas are covered by other parts of the building, but this way there's more option to have more areas of the door showing, and it's more realistic. I had a few final details to add to make these planks a door. First, for some hinges. I rolled out a thinner sheet of clay, cut 2 straight pieces from it. One end I cut away 2 triangles of material to give it a pointy end, and then I poked a few rivet marks along the piece, lightly tapped them with my sculpting tool to make them look a bit like forged metal. Technically, I think rivets would also stick out, not in, but I figured having marks would be better than just a flat piece. Final step necessary was the handle. I had some chain lying around that had circular links, so I removed one link, added a bit of clay to cover the opening in the ring, and hold it to the door. After carefully pressing the hinges and door handle to the door and throwing it all in the oven for 15 minutes, it was ready to be molded. As I said before, there were 2 main things I had changed from my last attempt. I used 100% silicone, and I mixed 1 part silicone with 1 part cornstarch by volume. Just a side note, I also added a few drops of food coloring to help see when the silicone and cornstarch were completely mixed in. In hindsight, it might have been better to add it to the silicone first, since I think there were a few bits of cornstarch that didn't get mixed with the silicone, since they are clumped around some food coloring. And just a side note, I ended up buying the silicone from the grocery store. I went to the hardware store last time and couldn't find any 100% silicone caulk, but at the grocery store most of the options were 100% silicone. So I'm not sure what's up with that. Maybe I was just looking in the wrong place. Who knows? I dumped the mixture on top of my door and hoped for the best. I added a layer of wax paper on top to even the top, similar way to how I made the clay flat. This isn't critical, but I think it'll help the casting process since the bottom of the mold will be level. I would have removed the wax paper after evening the top, so that it could get exposed to air and moisture and cure faster, hopefully. But the silicone was still very sticky and I didn't want it to pull up with the paper. I left the mold alone for 7 or 8 hours and it was pretty much cured. I was a little bit shocked. I knew the Instructables said the stuff could potentially cure in a few hours, but I didn't really believe it. Not when the last stuff took 4 weeks. See how nicely the wax paper peels off? Isn't it beautiful? I did notice a bit of a hole on the underside of the mold, so I squeezed a little bit of silicone in there. I didn't want to mix up a whole cornstarch silicone batch just for the one spot, and since it was pretty thin, it should cure no problem. There was a little bit of silicone that snuck under the door, so I trimmed up those edges by running an X-Acto along the sides of the door. And now, the moment of truth. What a relief. So this mold did cure all the way through. I'm not 100% sure what the reason is, since I did change 2 things, using 100% silicone and adding cornstarch. Maybe both of these changes are necessary. Maybe just using 100% silicone makes the difference, or maybe adding cornstarch to any silicone caulk would have done the trick. Who knows? Side note here, apparently my door handle wasn't touching the clay, so there was a little bit of silicone that got between the ring and the door. Unfortunately, the ring wasn't securely attached, so it did break off the door, which was sad, but not a huge deal. I just cleaned up the extra silicone with an X-Acto. Next time, though, I'd press the ring into the clay. All that's left is to cast some doors. I picked up some Perfect Cast. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it says it's stronger than plastic, so it must not be plaster. Did I say plastic? I meant plaster. I mixed up a bit and poured it into the mold. Voila. See how nice and level that mold is? The Perfect Cast did a really great job of picking up the wood grain details and everything except the door handle. I did mess around a little bit with the mold and cleaned up some of that handle area, so in trying it again I did get a little bit better handle, so I think doing that a little bit more would help again. Else in the future I'd use a slightly thicker ring and press it into the clay so that it would be more a part of the mold, which should really help those problems. It might be worth trying resin at some point as well, since it'd likely be more durable and might pick up some of these finer details better too, depending on the viscosity. It might pour into these narrow gaps better. There you have it. Much more successful casting experience. I like how these doors turned out. It was fun to paint up a couple of simple things and add some little bits of weathering effect to them. They feel really nice. They're nice and heavy, which is a nice weight to them. I'm not convinced that if I dropped them they wouldn't break, since it is like kind of a plastery material. But I'm really happy with how they turned out. And if you like this video, if you found it helpful, please hit the thumbs up. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing. With that, I'll see you in the future.